Decision time. Who is getting your fast pass straight through to next week's semi-final? Who's it? Well, I need an
about the essential do's and don'ts for social media. So this is for all staff across the site, and also talent, any execs that need advice about using social media and what's appropriate and what isn't. We also have a masterclass tomorrow with the Poldark team. So they're going to be talking about how social media help to boost viewing figures and listenerships figures. So that's an interesting one as well. So just to say, this afternoon, the remaining sessions that we have is interacting with our audience online and introduction to coding. So if you don't know anything about coding, I can guarantee when you leave that session, you'll know everything there is to know about coding. We have some free pizza at the back, and we also have drinks. So help yourselves to refreshments. But I'm going to hand over to Rowan now, who is going to take this masterclass. Rowan.
Hi there. To invite you to get a better seat at the front, premium seats down in front here. You're going to have to bear with me while I cycle back. You're going to get a sneak preview of all the things coming up. So hi, Rowan Kerrick-Robertson. I feel a bit funny standing behind this lecture, so I'm going to kind of dance about over here and look at my slides with you. So I'm going to talk to you today about personal use of social media for BBC staff, BBC freelancers, talent, execs. A tiny bit of background about me. So I was the social media lead for BBC Television from 2011 to 2014. And I worked in online communities, as we used to call them, for the BBC since about 2001, longer now than I care to remember. And a couple of years ago, I left the BBC and I now run my own company, helping other people with their social media. In my old role as social media lead for BBC Television, I used to do all sorts of things. Primarily, I used to help people, projects, programs, anyone who needed help across the whole of television with their social media requirements. I'd help with that and kind of sign off plans and that sort of thing. But I also worked very, very closely with editorial policy. I'm sure many of you will remember Julian Coles, who used to work very closely on their social media. Julian Coles and I used to work together an awful lot, and I helped him with the latest update of the editorial policy guidelines around social media use in a personal capacity. If you haven't read them, I do highly recommend. They look like this. They're online and available for all, not just BBC people, publicly available. But I highly recommend giving them a very brief read. They're fully intended to kind of make you feel confident about your use of social media, and they are in no way intended to kind of stop you from using social media. I know editorial policy are very keen to support people in that area. These are the kind of areas that we find kind of come up in this type of area. Very much kind of, it'll be no surprise to you here that kind of political neutrality is. Raise my voice, but not too loudly in case it comes back suddenly. So political neutrality is a kind of constant area for all people who are kind of editorially publishing on behalf of the BBC, so freelancers as well as staff. Editorial integrity, obviously, so you'll see some examples that I've got here today. You've already seen one from will.i.am there. Working with personalities is another area that comes up, particularly for execs who are kind of managing talent. You can imagine trying to manage someone like Alan Sugar, for example, in this area. Social media use is never absolutely at the top of your list, but always a concern. I've got a few cautionary tales before. I've got a bunch of examples that I'm hoping you guys will give me your opinions on and that we can talk about a little bit. But I've got some cautionary tales. So some of you may remember after the Japanese earthquake in 2011, Radio 4's Today Show sent James Nockety over to report on that. And there was a very cheeky tweet posted by one of the producers of the Today Show, which was about Jim Nockety striking it lucky in a love hotel. And that was really widely reported with This picture you can only see, I can only find half of it still online. There's nothing more exciting in the bottom half, if I'm honest. But that was really widely reported. You might say quiet news day, but there were a lot of slap wrists around this particular example. So, you know, that kind of editorial integrity of the BBC. Obviously, it's not just a BBC issue. Wherever you work, how you represent your employer. I always kind of think of it as, you know, when you're at school and your school kind of says when you're wearing your uniform, you're representing the school. Kind of is like that, isn't it? You know, this was, I suspect you can't read it, but this was posted on Facebook, I assume in a kind of private capacity actually, by a Buckingham Palace guard shortly before the royal wedding. Basically, he's kind of saying that Kate's a bit of a stuck-up cow and didn't wave at him, after which he got fired. This is a slightly more cheerful example, a silver lining cautionary tale, if you will. The legendary Ed Balls posts his own name as first tweet. Example, a cautionary tale of kind of having some idea of what you're doing before you do it. But I guess the silver lining is that I think he lived it down and probably benefits from it on Ed Balls Day every year. As a result, you can see nearly 80,000 retweets of that. So it has obviously entertained an awful lot of people at his expense. So I've got some examples that we're going to go through. I'm sort of suspecting that the mic might be useful if you want it picked up on the video, because I want to hear your opinions about this. So this is from an anonymous Manchester-based BBC journalist, so I'm sure you can read it over there, but shut up going on about how great Manchester is, George Osborne. We know it is, and flattery will not buy our votes now, kindly F off. So it's a pretty cut and dried example, really, isn't it? But does anyone feel that that's an appropriate tweet for a BBC employee? No, that's a pretty easy one, isn't it? Very intemperate language, you know, opens the BBC up to cries of political partisanship. I think generally that bit, you kind of can't change the language for that, you know, to make it okay. But actually, some of this you could rephrase. I think one of the themes that I notice around people's personal expression on social media is that quite often just tweaking the language, you know, really considering what you write very carefully, makes the difference between something which is over the line versus something which is actually kind of okay. Lovely Chris Packham. This is an example from a couple of years ago when the badger culling started. So I believe Chris Packham is freelance. I don't think he's BBC staff, but it's absolutely beyond doubt that he represents the BBC to the British public. I think that's unarguable. So this is a series of tweets about badger culling, and you will see very quickly that he actually is incredibly passionate about this. I suspect you guys at the back can't read it, so I'll read it for you. Bear with me, there's 6 of them. He felt very passionate. It is both sad and shameful that when night falls and the sets of southern England stir, their gentle folk will be needlessly slaughtered, that in spite of science and public will, the wrath of ignorance will further bloody and bleed our countryside of its riches of life. That brutalist thugs, liars and frauds will destroy our wildlife and dishonour our nation's reputation as conservationists and animal lovers. So I fear that tonight could be the darkest for British wildlife that we have witnessed in our lives. Bear with me. I feel sick, sad, disempowered, betrayed, angry and crushed by the corruption of all that I know is right. I feel rage. So what do people feel about that? Would anyone have posted that themselves on Twitter? Go on, hands up. Who thinks that's generally fine? And so you think that's okay? Yeah? Yeah? Yeah?
Hang on.
I think we might need the mics in here, actually.
I just want to ask, has Chris Packham not got Asperger's syndrome, which is obviously doesn't self-moderate in terms of how he uses his language?
Do you know what? I don't know. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I've met him and it didn't, you know.
I'm pretty sure that he's got something in the spectrum.
Has he? I did not know that.
There you go.
But I think it's very, very, very strong language, isn't it? I know actually a lot of these examples I've spoken to David Jordan, head of editorial policy, about in the past, and he was called up at the weekend about this particular example. Even though I think he kind of felt like some of the language was in truth too strong, the actual kind of sentiment behind them was fine for him to post. And that's because even though he kind of, works as a nature presenter, part of his job is not, and now will never be, interviewing people about badger culling. So, for example, it's totally out that Chris Packham's going to interview the National Farmers Union about badger culling because he's so partisan on the subject. But generally, it was kind of given a slightly, I guess, a slightly deep-breathed, that's okay, by editorial policy. Here's a tweet by someone who works, he's a BJ for news. It's Amal Clooney. So Amal Clooney at the BBC today discussing human rights in Azerbaijan. Any issues? No one's screaming out with any issues. It's actually kind of largely fine, as you might imagine, but it's actually against contract to publish photos taken inside the BBC. So this without proper authorization to do so. It is, isn't it? And it's something that people kind of do constantly forget. I've got another example in a minute. So this is we can say this is probably fine because he's a BJ and he kind of rather looks like he's quite behind the scenes. It's probable that this was kind of, part of their production setup and he was kind of given the thumbs up. What wouldn't be okay, so for example, I know on Doctor Who, they've got absolute lockdown. No one posts anything about anything. If that, you can imagine if that was Doctor Who just taking a little shot on set and posting that on Twitter. Absolutely not. So it really depends on the production that you're working on and the situation that you're showing. Here's going back to that idea of kind of talent management in this area. This is that example that you've seen previously. So the scenario is that will.i.am, presenter on The Voice, is announcing one of the contestants who's going to kind of go through to next week. Bear with me, it takes a moment to play. I won't play all of it. You've seen it a couple of times already.
It is decision time. Who is getting your balls pass straight through to next week's semi-final? Who's it going to be, Will? I need a name.
The person that I'm going to be giving a...
Will, I need a name.
The person I'm going to be putting through... Hey, hold on, please, seriously. The music is playing. It's getting serious. I'm going to tweet it. So you don't know who I'm looking at, because I'm zooming in.
I think Twitter may find out before we do.
Booyah!
Will, I really need a name, please.
What?
Say it. Will. It's Leah. Leah goes straight to the semi-final.
There we go. So I've kind of got about 3 issues with that. Does anybody here have any issues with that? If you worked on The Voice, would you have been happy about it? Well, I think it's quite clear that it's off the cuff, isn't it? There's a shaking head. Why are you shaking your head?
Can I just give you...
Sorry.
I guess they didn't know he was going to do it, for one.
That's one of my issues, exactly, yeah. How brilliant to be bringing in. So I guess one of my issues is brilliant to be sort of bringing that kind of multi-platform interactivity right into the heart of your show. That, I think, for lots of people is, a big tick. The Voice had been charged by Danny Cohen, controller of TV at that time, with being more interactive, really speaking to kind of youth, really speaking to that demographic. So they weren't they weren't doing something kind of, wildly out of their remit. I think one of the issues is obviously that the words loose cannon wouldn't be inappropriate about that. That would make me feel really unsettled if I was working directly on The Voice. Kind of that, and we all know he's been pulled up on a number of different issues around his kind of social media use. I guess it's that kind of thing that he hasn't talked about it with the production team in advance. Great idea, but kind of done in millions of people watching. Let's just riff. Far from ideal execution of a good idea. I think one of my other issues, is undue prominence of Twitter in that particular example. So any of you who've worked on shows where you do include social media mentions will know that actually those social media mentions are very carefully orchestrated in regards to kind of things like the number of times you can mention Twitter and Facebook within your show, balanced against what the call to action is. How exciting, how brilliant is it for the audience? And certainly I used to spend, in the run-up to The Voice, I used to spend quite a lot of time brokering those type of deals between editorial policy and the production team. So we would literally get to kind of one mention of Twitter, one mention of Facebook per show, 3 uses of hashtag per show, within the different formats, that type of thing. And you can see here that there are a lot of mentions of Twitter in that tiny segment. The other thing I think, which is kind of depending on your view really, is that it's absolutely possible that the Twitter audience found out who that winner was before the BBC One audience. And for me, I kind of sit on the fence, because that's the way I'm built. But I know certainly when I've talked about this example with people before, some people kind of feel like, absolutely not, license fee payers first. BBC One audience has to know that sort of thing first. Whereas other people kind of think, well, that's the nature of interactivity, that some people on Twitter are going to find something out before your live TV audience. The truth of this is that actually, because of the joys of technology, that tweet went live very, very slowly. And the BBC One audience did find out well in advance, I think, compared to people who were just looking on Twitter. Here's another example, goes back to that same thing we were talking about a moment ago about photos. So this is just somebody who works for Top Gear and Eurovision. So Newshound spotted in BBC Newsroom at NBH. Can you spot him? There's a dog. So how does this strike people? Anyone think it's absolutely fine? Anyone? So I think it's quite possible that this is sort of not fine, actually. This person doesn't work on news, so part of the newsroom, and it goes back to that kind of idea of publishing photos of BBC Workplace. It's possible that they did go to the right person and ask them, but I'd have a kind of sneaky suspicion that this was kind of shot as, waiting for the lift at NBH in London. It's a great photo. Yeah. Oh, sorry, do wait for the mic. Thank you.
No, I'm just going to make the observation. I mean, I think you're right. It's probably not fine because the rules dictate that we don't, and you can see the circumstances in which snapping things that were going on in the newsroom could be quite damaging. But actually,
it's not damaging.
It's not. It's pretty harmless.
And also,
I think it's much less, without digressing back the way, it's much less reputationally damaging than Chris Packham, for example.
Oh, yeah.
I think
it's not reputationally damaging at all, is it?
No.
It's just kind of one of those clauses in the contract. And I think that's I kind of think a lot of these things are kind of shades of grey. Hopefully mostly white, but sort of shades of grey. I think the other thing about this, when I was looking at it again earlier, is, actually that's a very familiar site. That's on telly. That bit of NBH is on telly in the news loads. So to me, it kind of feels like, I think I've had that instinct before in MBH where you see something that you're kind of like, oh, and then it like literally kind of stops at that moment where you go, oh, I'm not meant to post that. I don't think it's you know, sackable offence, is it? You hope not.